I'm really pleased now to formally introduce Dr. Kimberly Voll. Um, Kim is currently CEO of Brace Yourself Games, but is a veteran game designer and researcher with well over a decade's experience, including, for example, at Riot Games. And she also holds a PhD in computer science and has taught, including at the master's level. But we at Prosocial Design Network discovered Kim and her work when we were tipped off to the Digital Thriving Playbook that was created by the Thriving in Games group, both of which Kim was a co-founder of. And if you don't know it, the playbook is really an extraordinary resource, which we perhaps presumptuously see as a parallel and sister resource to our prosocial design library. And yet, when we dug into the playbook and we have a set of conversation with Kim, we know we've so much to learn from social game developers who think about prosociality. And not surprisingly, because also we've learned there are lots of reasons to believe, lots of reasons why prosocial engagement is really elemental to the success of social gaming. So welcome, Kim.
Thank you so
Um,
much.
and we're going to start off with that last point. So social gaming designers, we've learned again, think a lot about prosocial design. So can you talk about why that's so? Why is prosocial design so important in gaming, and why you think it might be compared to other digital spaces?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. It's a joy to be here. Excited to connect with this group. I have lurked in the corners for a long time, so it's lovely to have this opportunity to speak with you all and be a part of things. So thank you so much for that. Great question. I think that prosociality is one of those incredibly fundamental aspects of how we interact as a species that is not just fundamental in our in-person connections, but of course in our digital spaces as well. And I think it is something that, I'm delighted about groups like the Prosocial Design Network, and of course we have leaned very heavily into prosociality. I think that this is something that we really need to talk a lot more about. I would preface my comments really quickly, just for the benefit of this group as well, which might not all be game designers or as familiar with that space. I think I like to refer to what we're doing as a lot of the work that we're doing as referring to player dynamics. So essentially what I mean by that is it allows us to center on the social dynamics, the group dynamics, system dynamics, even population dynamics, language dynamics, all of that fun stuff. And the emergent dynamics within digital spaces, the interactions and so forth. I think that's very important because historically social gaming has often implied a divide as if it were a particular type of gaming, whereas everything that we're talking about, the prosociality of these spaces is fundamental to all spaces where people gather and all digital spaces where people gather. So this is inclusive of all games with more than one player. It's even inclusive of some single player experiences where interactions may exist in maybe a non-traditional form, not as direct moment-to-moment interactions, but perhaps asynchronously in the broader community and so forth. So with all of that, why is this important? Why is this interesting? I think that it is because when we step back and we look at what the outcomes of these spaces we are creating and that we are the caretakers of, at the end of the day, what we really care about are, can we create spaces where people thrive? And I happened on this notion of thriving. I think several of us happened on it in a very similar time frame, but partly because a part of my career in space focused actually in medicine from many years ago. So, I was teaching aspects of medicine and encountered concepts like salutogenic design and whatnot. And more importantly, I encountered this notion of thriving. And thriving really is when you're able to live in a way that allows your capacities, your values, your connections to really unfold meaningfully in time, even in the presence of hardship. So it's dynamic. It doesn't mean feeling good all the time. It means having the resiliency to weather things like stress, pain, or conflict, the capacity to recover. It means belonging without erasure. So having a place, having a sense of belonging, having your inner reality reflected and respected. And it means agency, having your concerns matter in the context in which they exist. And so that all comes together to generate digital thriving, which we define as the ideal outcome of well-designed online digital spaces, inclusive of games, that really are intended to make the world a better place. And I think that prosociality and prosocial design, that gives us the systems, the norms, the affordances that allow us to create designs that encourage people to act in a way that benefits others or a collective, intentionally or unintentionally.
That is incredible and also just really inspiring. I hadn't heard you speak about it that way. And there's so many elements that resonate here about thriving. And you kind of anticipated the next question that, so I hear a lot like core principles, like uh, increasing people's capacities and honor their connections and values and resiliency. Um, could you talk a little bit more if there any kind of like core principles if you for folks to think about beginning to think about pro-social design, like what are the core principles or approaches? And so maybe taking those principles and beginning to think about like how would you, yeah, create that kind of space where you can have thriving.
Yeah, it's such an excellent question because I think at the end of the day, what we're all striving toward in this space is being able to bring a little bit more intentionality to the outcomes that we're trying to generate. And the outcomes are, of course, spaces that are safer, that are more conducive to the kinds of interactions that are uh, uh, what's the word I'm looking for, that generate a greater sense of well-being, but also if you're talking about in the game space that are generating healthier interactions and great play experiences and so forth. So a lot of what we focus on are designs that really encourage people to act in ways that are a little bit more cooperative, a little bit more community building centric, instead of harmful or disruptive. Like safety is always at the crux of everything that we do, but we're also very cognizant of people who can show up perhaps with different expectations of the experience that can disrupt it and then can generate frustration among other players, which then can escalate into disrupting a larger community or eventually more fundamentally eroding the resiliency of the community and the quality and trust therein of the relationships. So for us, some of the core principles are things like how do you support healthy social behaviors? So I said at the outset that we're not just talking about social gaming. So I'm not just talking about a chat service, chat function. I'm not just talking about emojis. I'm talking about all the ways in which we show up together in a space and may influence each other's experiences within that space. So healthy social behaviors in that context are ones where people come away feeling potentially enriched at sort of the highest level, but at the very least, they don't come away feeling diminished in their sense of safety in that space, diminished in the sense that they're becoming frustrated and so forth. So thinking about these aspects from a very design-centric and intentional perspective. The other thing we think a lot about is the building blocks of trust, which for those of you already kind of well-versed in pro-sociality, you're probably quite familiar with these, but it's the idea that we as humans fundamentally have an ease of connection, if you will, a fluidity that comes about when we feel a baseline similarity to someone, that when we're in a familiar environment or someone feels familiar to us or a social situation feels familiar. When we have the benefit of repeated interactions or a sense of proximity and reciprocity. And that's a really important one for us as game designers, because often the spaces that we're designing have a layer of interactivity. They also have, for example, potentially you might have a character or an avatar that can act as a proxy for body language and other ways in which we as humans connect. So thinking through those different pieces and looking at the opportunities within your space to try to promote some of those points of connection to foster greater trust, while also, I mean, this is a huge topic, so I'll just throw in a juicy bullet point, while also being mindful to the risks that come with a space that is built on a higher foundation of trust, because of course that does open us up to potentially people to exploit those systems as well.
Just speaking generally to the complexity of human dynamics, absolutely. Um, so as I said, there's so much that I think other digital spaces, particularly social media, can learn from. from social gaming, could you talk maybe about a couple that you see, a couple of opportunities or blind spots where um, people who are developing other kinds of platforms should be learning from what you're up
Yeah,
to?
yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think there's so much overlap in digital spaces in general. I think that one thing that unites us all who do work in digital spaces is that these spaces are, at the end of the day, pretty diminished when it comes to our capacity to relate to one another and communicate with one another. And I think one of the things that we have learned is that ease of communication and the success of communication critically is a very important part to the success of interactions on the whole, and the likelihood that someone has an interaction and comes away from it maybe not thinking to themselves, that sure was successful, but at the very least, coming away with a positive mindset about how that interaction went. And those things are very, very important because it gives the opportunity for us to be thoughtful about how we can increase the likelihood of interactions going successfully, whether that's through more successful communications or direct play interactions, which I think can transcend all digital spaces. Playful encounters can exist in non-game specific contexts, and I think can go a long way to, if you will, greasing the wheels of how we interface. So I think those sorts of aspects naturally transcend these environments, but always starting from a perspective of what are the underminers, what are the barriers to successful interactions that exist in these environments, and looking at them in a very human-centric, pro-social way of what would we like to see in these environments that would increase that likelihood of them being successful.
I really appreciate it so much because one of the some of the pushback we get thinking about pro-social design is like really what is the place of designers to kind of to really direct behavior, but the way it's phrasing it in a very positive way that these are we have an opportunity to be really mindful and producing these positive interactions. So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to throw it up to Q&A. So if folks have questions that are percolating, start dropping in the chat or forming them in your minds, and we will open up the floor in a couple minutes. But last question to you, Dr. Vole. What should we be learning? What don't we know? And should people who are doing research in this realm really be focusing on to better understand?
Yeah, I have sort of a two-part answer to that. One, just very briefly, would be building on the point you just made, which to me kind of gets at the question of where we draw the line between a healthy obligation to protect and intervene in the digital spaces in which we are responsible for, versus interfering with the natural autonomy of players or communities. I think that is an incredibly hard problem. How do we navigate differences of opinion, both within, our studios, for example, within player bases, within communities at large, but also across regional and cultural boundaries in a way that is respectful and inclusive of those differences, while still holding space for the fundamental values that I think are so important to the work that we do. So I think that requires a lot of work navigating that. The second thing I think is similar to what I just said a moment ago, which is that these spaces are so diminished. They are absent so many of the social affordances, the communication channels that we've evolved to need, essentially. I would hazard we just don't really feel truly co-located online. And I think that is one of the problems. I think that is a requirement to a certain extent of healthy online spaces. There's just so many things that interfere with our ability to relate to one another, which is exacerbated by, of course, the attention economy today, the reduction to us versus them that online spaces seem to really press us toward, the supernormal stimuli, that defy our ability to regulate our response to them, and we don't work super well at scale as a species. So these amount to digital spaces, unfortunately, for all of the ways in which they connect us and the power that they afford us, they can ultimately be very dehumanizing spaces. And I think a very important aspect of the work that we need to be doing is asking ourselves, how do we rehumanize them? What does that look like? What is a path to digital thriving in these environments?
Thank you so much. We are going to move to Q&A. Before that, we'll just end the recording.
Awesome. Thank you.